excited, and this year we decided, because of all those downloads and considerably fewer sales, we decided that we would go green this year. And so we have published the executive summaries, which you all have, and we'll have those to give out to people. But for the full index, which is this, you can download that for free. You have the executive summary in your hands, and for the full index, you can download that from our website. Now, let me just point to, I'm going to bring up a couple of slides, and just to go over the numbers very, very quickly, because then I want to move on to where the puck is going to be and skate towards that. You have all, for those of you in the back, you have in the executive summary on page 3 and 4, you are going to have these two charts, if you find that easier to look at, if you're having trouble seeing. I want you just to look at the chart on the left. This represents all financial flows from developed countries to developing countries from 1990 to 2009, okay? And the bottom line, the sort of purple line, is all of the government aid to the developing world. And the top line represents a combination of 3 private flows: philanthropy, remittances, and private capital investment. And the purpose of this slide is to just show, if you look to the left at 1990, you'll see that those two lines change. And it was at 1990 that all private financial flows became larger than all government flows. And that ratio, by the way, was the opposite 30 years ago. The government flows were the dominant, and the private flows were the smaller. And so what did that reflect? It reflected a changing developing world where there were more private partners to receive funds. It reflected a growth in philanthropy here. It reflected the tremendous wealth accumulation that was happening in the United States. And TV and internet was linking problems to us in a much more dramatic way. And so that's what that reflects. The next chart on the right will show you the breakout of those 4 flows. And the one on the yellow on the top, the one that takes the deep dip, is private capital investment. And that deep dip came in the last 3 months of 2008. Because our data is for the last year that we have available for this comparative data is 2009. And so that shows what dipped there. What was interesting, though, it was short-term capital. It was bonds. It was not foreign direct investment, which actually went up in 2008. It was people were just pulling their money out of anything in the developing world so they could have cash. And then, but you can see in 2009 that private capital investment is now coming back up, and the trends for 2010 have a continuous rise as well. So the next flow is remittances at 174 billion, and they fell a little bit, as you can see, but are on the rise again in 2010. And the flow after that, 120 billion, is the government aid, and then global philanthropy from all developed nations to the developing world is what we are measuring at 53 billion, which we know is an underestimate. We think our U.S. number is pretty close to accurate now, but we don't have completely accurate numbers for the European countries, the other developed countries. So we know that it's going to be higher than that. And as we move along and get better numbers, we'll raise that as well. Now, this is probably the number that you're most interested in. This was for 2009, the U.S., all financial flows from the U.S. to the developing world. As you can see, our U.S. official development assistance is 28.8 billion, and private philanthropy totaled 37.5 billion. And that's made up of the numbers underneath of foundations at 4.6 billion, corporations 8.9 billion, private and voluntary organizations, CARE, Save the Children, NGOs like that, volunteerism, universities and colleges, and religious organizations. And I want to draw your attention to 2 numbers on this, and that is, look at remittances at 90.7 billion in 2009, which was the first full year of the recession. U.S. remittances were actually higher than private capital investment. So they were just a clear lifeline to the poor at a time when private flows were falling, and private philanthropy actually stayed pretty steady. It actually increased a couple 100,000. If we can talk about an increase there, but certainly didn't make any big dips. And I want to say one thing, and that is too on the religious giving, and the 7.2 billion. That is probably actually larger than that, and because right now. That number primarily represents what religious organizations send directly to organizations overseas, okay? And we ask, when in the survey that we do of religious organizations, we ask them to estimate how much they give to U.S. PVOs. And we don't think we have as good a data on that as to what PVOs are reporting that they got from churches. So probably that it's quite possible that religious organizations might be the highest number. And we're going to work on that in the future and see if we can sort that out better. We feel we're capturing the total amount better by attributing it to PVOs right now. But in any event, I think it's a very interesting thing. We have Byron Johnson here today from Baylor, who is head of the Institute of Studies on Religion. And, of course, Opportunities International has done faith-based giving. And I think this is it's not that religious giving is new, because I was at doing a talk somewhere, and somebody said, well, what about this new fad of religious giving? I said, it's hardly new. It has been around, before anyone was out there. And I said, it's just that we only got smart a couple of years ago and really went out and tried to measure it and see what was there. And so, because we've all known that, and the stat that the World Bank has come out with has said that half of the health care delivered in Africa, at least at some point, was delivered by missionaries working in their hospitals. So it's always been big. We've just never been able to get a handle on it. And we're excited to be doing that now, and excited that Baylor, through Byron's Institute, has taken over the resource funding of this religious giving study. So we're hoping to institutionalize it so we can continue to keep it going and dive deeper into those numbers. So next will simply be a couple more slides only. The regional breakdown of philanthropy. We actually now have regions that it's going to, and we think are pretty accurate. And the regional breakdown is not that much different than the U.S. Government aid, except for the fact that the U.S. government aid gives more to North Africa and the Middle East, for obvious reasons, with Afghanistan and Iraq. And so philanthropy does less in North Africa and the Middle East. But other than that, the regional distribution is fairly similar. This is a sectoral breakdown of U.S. philanthropy. And I thought this was an interesting slide as well. It's, again, not too different from the U.S. government distribution. Here we have the preponderance of funds going into health. And economic development is about the same as the U.S. government, and I think the U.S. government has more in disaster relief. And just as a final slide, this is not in your executive summary, but I throw this up for where the challenges are. If we believe that it's good to have these numbers, that it's important to know what's going on out there, that if that measurement is important to improving things, which we firmly believe it is, and helping it grow, when you measure things, then we have our work cut out for us. Because this little chart here, my last chart, as you see, the green are the numbers that the DAC donor countries, all the developed country donor countries, report as their private giving number to the OECD in Paris, okay? Then we have been able to collect better data for 14 of the 23 DAC countries. And that is reflected in the sort of brownish red line that you see. So the biggest example is France, who reports nothing in private giving to the DAC. And we have, working with a French researcher, have been able to find at least $1 billion. And another interesting one is the United Kingdom, which is at the bottom. second from the bottom, it looks like, or maybe, yeah, second in countries, or third, I guess, is the third line from the bottom. Thanks, Susan. You're my Vanna White, right?
Would you like a vowel?
Okay, you have to stop. Okay, the UK reports $330 million, and we found just using GuideStar, paying GuideStar to get us the numbers, which is very exciting. The GuideStar is building up. We got, what is that, 6.2? I can't read. Oh, 6.26 billion. So the good news here is that countries are getting interested in this, because now the MDGs are saying, hey, we should be setting, the private giving should be contributing to the MDGs. People are questioning the private sector. What are you doing for the MDGs? So there's a much greater interest in the amount of these funds. And I was invited to present our numbers to a big conference in Japan, and then thereafter we had a team from the Japanese government come over to talk with all of our researchers on how we did it, and they are going to start working on it. We're receiving inquiries from other countries, and so we hope, the vision would be to get other countries doing what we're now helping them do on a jumpstart basis, that other countries start measuring and doing this so we can have really good and comparable numbers. And it's starting to happen, always slower than we expect. But that's where we want to go, wherever that puck is going. So I just make 3 conclusions about our data: that private giving remittances are holding steady, they're an important lifeline to the poor in times of recession, and they are amazingly sophisticated. And when you do read the download here, we have many of the traditional projects like the amazing Cargill cocoa growing project in Ivory Coast, the Niobani project, but we also have a program a public-private partnership, Kilomo Salama mentioned, which is a way that farmers in Kenya can get crop insurance and get a premium number, pay their insurance, and get reimbursed if there is a drought without ever seeing a piece of paper, all through a cell phone. It's phenomenal. Our own insurance company should be looking at this model. So, and I know we're going to hear lots more about this on today's panel, the role that technology has made. So now I feel like it would be good to skate a little bit. Our panelists are going to do a brief summary of where they think the puck is going in philanthropy, remittances, foreign aid in general, however they wanted to define it, and not to throw out a wet towel on expert predictions. I couldn't help mentioning just a few from past experts. And let me start our session. Everybody's waving their head here. Yale University professor Irving Fisher, a noted economist, proclaimed in 1929 that, quote, stocks have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau, unquote. Charles Duell, the U.S. Patent Office Commissioner, I love this one, announced to the nation in 1899 that, quote, everything that can be invented has been invented, unquote. And Lee DeForest, noted physicist and engineer who transmitted the first radio program and put the first sound to film, argued in 1926, quote, while theoretically and technically television may be feasible, commercially and financially I consider it an impossibility, a development of which we need spend little time dreaming. Okay. IBM Chairman Thomas Watson's prediction in 1958 when he said, I think there's a world market for about 5 computers. And some years later, Microsoft founder, I'll end with this, Bill Gates, long before he was the second wealthiest man in the world, Carlos Slim just took over. Long before he was this multi-billionaire, predicted that 640 Ks of memory ought to be enough for anyone on their computer. So, okay, so.
And you want us to go into this?
This is what I didn't tell them I was going to be saying. Some have fared better, though. Philip Tetlock, who was a retired business and psychology professor at UC Berkeley, said that the worst predictors were hedgehogs, people who have a big idea and they came up with that idea and they're going to apply it no matter what. They burrow in and they put that framework on any phenomena they see. But he said the ones that had more success in predicting were foxes. And the foxes were the ones who know many small things, are skeptical of grand schemes, and diffident about their forecasting skills. Okay? So that's why we invited the foxes today to forecast where global philanthropy is going. And we are going to start with Dennis Whittle, who is the president of the Whittle Group and co-founder of Global Giving, and really the whole founder of the development marketplace at the World Bank. But the most important thing on his resume right now is that he has just adopted, he and his wife Mari have adopted a 3-year-old Chinese orphan, Calvin. And he's named after the comic strip Calvin Hobbes, and I'll let Dennis tell you why. And I saw him the other day, and he's adorable. So, Dennis, over to you.
All right. So I will resist the temptation to show you 64 slides of Calvin.
I didn't let them go.
Well, you could have brought Calvin.
We should have. So. I think the difference between me and Wayne Gretzky is that we can both see where the puck is going, but he actually gets there when the puck gets there. And I'm sitting on the ice on my backside. So. Several years ago in Indonesia, when President Suharto had just fallen, a friend of mine at the World Bank and some Indonesian colleagues decided to do something unusual. They were carrying out a community development project in about 100 communities around Indonesia. And they went into each participating community and they told the mayor, there's one thing you have to do as a condition of participating in this project. And that's you have to put a billboard in the town square that just describes the activities that are going to be funded and how much you're going to spend on it. Very simple. Billboard with paint, town square. And he said, furthermore, once a month you have to have a public meeting, and anybody in the community can come to this meeting, and they have to be able to talk about whatever they want to talk about. Now, Indonesia, for those of you who have been there or worked there, is an extremely hierarchical and conflict-averse society. So the first months when these meetings were held, all the village people filed in and they all sat in a circle on the ground, and the village headman came out and unveiled the billboard and said, here's what we're spending this World Bank money on. Any questions? And everyone said, no, this looks great, fabulous. And tea was served, and they drank the tea, and everyone broke up and went back out into the town and walked around. But there was a little grumbling after this meeting. They didn't say anything in the meeting, but there was a little grumbling. And so the next month, when the village chief invited everyone back in, he presented the progress on the various projects, a bridge here and a hospital there. And he said, any questions? And he was about to ask for the tea to be served, which in Indonesia is a signal that the official meeting is over, when one person raised his hand in the back. And that person said, Pot Mayor. And the mayor looked up shocked. And he said, what do you want? And he said, well, this is all good, what I'm seeing on the billboard, but, what my children would really like is a new elementary school on this side of the river. And everyone was shocked at the temerity and the recklessness of this villager to raise his hand. And the mayor didn't know what to say, but he made some notes, and then he signaled for the tea to be served. And the tea was served, and the meeting was over. And the third month, when the mayor called the meeting, he went through the same routine. And he was about to have the tea to be served. And then a woman in the back raised her hand and said, Mr. Mayor, I have a question for you. And he said, what's that? And she said, I see that you're spending 2 million rupiah on this bridge going across that stream over there. And well, my husband is a contractor, and he tells me that that really shouldn't cost more than maybe 1,000,000 rupiah. And why are we spending 2,000,000 rupiah for that bridge? This did not make the mayor very happy. The mayor asked for the tea to be served and concluded the meeting. And the mayor was very unhappy about the whole process. And he tried to avoid having the meeting the fourth month, but my friend insisted that this is part of the rules of the game. And so in the fourth month, he presented progress with everything and asked if there were any questions, and at the same time was ordering for the tea to be served. And a young guy raised his hand in the back row. And the mayor said, yes, what do you want? And he said, the young guy said, he said, this is really interesting that we see this data on the money being spent from the World Bank project. He said, why can't we see this data on the rest of the city budget, on the rest of the budget that we're spending in our village? The mayor didn't even answer. He immediately asked for the tea to be served and tried to conclude the meeting. The people refused to conclude the meeting that time, and that meeting went on for several hours. And within a month or two, that mayor was no longer the mayor of that village. And this sent quite a ripple effect throughout Indonesia. Now, I tell that story because I believe that's where the puck is going, not only in philanthropy and not only in international aid, but in the world as a whole. And I believe we're going to be entering a period in the next decade or two of three phenomena that are going to be happening. And these phenomena can be hastened and accelerated and supported by philanthropy, I believe. I believe the foreign aid business will come in second in pushing this. But I think there will be three phenomena that I think we can look forward to. One is the democratization of voice. The old system of philanthropy and the old system of foreign aid have been about people dressed like us here in Washington and capitals, doing reports, trying to determine what people should have, how they should get it, delivering it to them, and then doing fancy evaluations on how those projects went. That era is over. In 10 years, that will seem like a crazy idea. We're entering a period of democratization of voice where anyone in the world will be able to contribute to the question of what people should get, how they should get it, and how it went. And new technologies, which we've heard some about today and we can talk a lot more about, are going to enable all this democratization of voice to take place. And in conjunction with the democratization of voice is going to come real-time voice and real-time feedback loops. And this may be the most revolutionary thing of all. We were talking earlier about doing evaluations of projects and how different agencies evaluate their projects and how it doesn't work very well, et cetera, et cetera. One reason it doesn't work very well is it usually takes place 3 or 4 years after the fact when everybody's forgotten about it and has no influence on the future. You're seeing new technologies that allow people in real time to tell you how a project is going, to tell you if the teacher is there in school, or from satellites to tell you if deforestation has happened with a particular hectare of land or not. New technologies, rapid real-time feedback to allow instant changes in course. And not only real-time, but public. Carol talked about the blog that she's got that you've been working on. As things become more public, there's going to be more and more pressure to take action to remedy and rectify situations. So real-time feedback is the second phenomenon. And the third thing that this implies is new roles for nonprofits, NGOs, private voluntary organizations, and even aid agencies. 10 or 15 years from now, these agencies are going to perceive that their role is going to be to conduct this conversation between donors and beneficiaries, conduct a constructive discussion. What do beneficiaries want, and what are donors giving them? And they're going to help both sides talk to each other. And they're going to help both sides talk to each other in public. And this is going to radically change not only the role of NGOs and other intermediaries, but the pressure on beneficiaries and donors to perform. And Carol and her group here at Hudson have created the first mock-up of the global billboard of philanthropy. And I think what we're going to see in the next decade or two are people raising their hand and saying, "Pa, we didn't really want that bridge. Or why is that hospital costing $2 million? Why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? And I look forward to being back here in a decade where we have your first report on the global conversation on the billboard, Carol. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. That's wonderful. We'll make comments about all this at the end of the presentations, and then, of course, have questions open for you. And now we're going to have David Sims, who is the board chair of Opportunity International Network, and you have everybody's bios on your chairs, and is a leader in micro lending, savings, and insurance in 28 developing countries through OI. And David, I want to just pose one question to you, and I hope that you'll be able to give us some comment on this, and that is microfinance has been in the news. And so I'm not going to go through the litany. What we do have in our new index, we've done a wonderful piece on microfinance and the charges that were being made against Muhammad Yunus and looking into it. And David this is his field, because OI has been just a leader in microfinance and now moving into savings and insurance. And so if you could give us a comment on, what has happened there, and was the Muhammad Yunus model flawed? What happened when the loan sharks came in? And why is it that now the lending market, and certainly in some areas of India, has really dried up, and what needs to be done? And is that a symbol that you really can't bring nonprofits into for-profit ventures, or should we give up all hope, or what's the answer? Thank you, David. He doesn't get to say whatever he wanted to say. He has to answer our question.
I can answer your question. The answer is no. We don't give up all hope. So, and then I'll move on. No, I will address Carol's question, but let me first thank you for the chance to be with you today. I thought it was a very interesting way to frame the question about where is the puck going to be, because it does force us to think a little bit in the future. And I want to let you know that I'm sharing today based on a long history in the microfinance space. I've been a donor and a volunteer, heavily involved in the board of Opportunity International for over 27 years. So I have the luxury of having seen many things that didn't work and lots of change. And one of the advantages as we confront challenges today is to say I've seen lots of challenges over the last couple of decades. And that just gives me a little bit of a perspective to address some of Carol's questions. Before I get to what the field of microfinance is today and where the puck may be tomorrow, I actually thought it would be helpful if I went back in time and gave you a bit of a perspective on how the history of microfinance started and what philanthropy was funding back when I first became involved. And then I'll transition through some of what we've seen in the last decade and what I think that means for where the puck's going to be going forward. And obviously, in a short amount of time, this is going to be an express view of history of microfinance. But I'm going to start, for those of you that aren't that familiar with microfinance, with what captured my interest and my heart some 2 decades plus ago. And back then, I visited a program that Opportunity was running in Jamaica. I met a woman that had been a loan client of Opportunity in Jamaica. And my favorite question whenever I'm visiting the field is to say, what's different about your life because of the involvement that you've had with Opportunity? I want to see what's changed. And it's hard to tell from a woman that's been getting a loan at this point for the last 6 years about what's different. But she could walk us, the little group that I was part of, around to the back of her house, and she pointed to a large group of chickens. And the first loans that she'd gotten from Opportunity were for some chickens that allowed her to have an egg business and to take the chicks that were raised up and sell off chicks and to have more chickens. Well, there was a lot of chickens in her backyard. You can imagine the aroma, but she was very proud of what she had done as an entrepreneur and as a business owner. But she said, David, that's not the most important thing, because she had her 2 daughters with her as well. Her 2 daughters had gone to school all the way through and into college because she had the income in order for the 2 girls to go to school. And we take it for granted that our kids can go to school, but in the developing world, I think everybody in this room knows that's not automatically true. But her 2 girls were in college at this point. And then she said, David, what you also wouldn't know is that when I started out, I was in a cardboard shack. And we were standing next to a building that was cement block walls with a tin roof and electricity running into it. So fundamentally, her economic circumstances had changed because of the power of a loan and what loan in the hands of an entrepreneur can do to create wealth for a family, to feed them, to give them a brighter future, and to touch the next generation in education. So why did donors give to Opportunity back then? Why did I start giving to Opportunity? It's because the return on investment, I couldn't find a better one, private sector or social sector. It was a hand up, not a handout. It was given with dignity. And back then, the 90+% repayment rates, since then the repayment rates in the industry have grown to averaging 95 to 98%, means that the money that we gave in 1983, my first check to Opportunity, was still being recycled to families to use a decade and more later. So donors and philanthropy were involved because we could see how it touched individual lives. Now, Byron and I were talking earlier about we'd love to have the statistics to prove globally what the impact is, but I knew in my heart that we were making a difference. But I'm going to fast forward now because the question is, where's the puck going in philanthropy? And I want to talk about the last decade and what we've seen. Because back in my early days with Opportunity, it was purely done globally, not just at Opportunity, through NGOs. There were no formal financial institutions. That's where we've gone in the last decade. Most of us refer to those as banks. For Opportunity, we like to think about calling them community banks because we want to make a difference in the communities of the poor families that we seek to serve. But why did we move into banks? For those of you that aren't bankers, you may understand this intellectually, but there are 2 real reasons about why philanthropy was so interested in pushing the envelope to get microfinance into banks. And one is pure business says leverage, that it's a good business model, that to the extent that you can mobilize deposits as a source of capital from which you can fund more loans, and that's true, it gives you a greater ability to impact more families with those loans, just like the lady got a loan to expand her chicken business. And at Opportunity, just within our own little world of microfinance, our deposits currently total $145 million. The total deposit growth last year totaled $32 million. To put that in contrast for you, $32 million is just a tad under the $35 million that we raised from donors in the U.S. last year. So our ability to mobilize capital is significantly enhanced by the structure that we've put it in, let alone what the structure has done in terms of allowing us to access investment capital. So in addition to deposits, we also borrow funds locally. An Opportunity today has raised $158 million in local debt. So our total loan portfolio today is $317 million. So as you think about the role of philanthropy, it has significantly leveraged the impact it can have on the lives of the poor. But lest you think that I'm only talking about business, and David, you sound like a banker here, let me talk to you about the real reason that we had to get into savings. And I was late to the game, I'll admit, in understanding this. That the reason for doing banks is because the value of savings and deposits, I would argue, is more important in the lives of the poor than is credit. And that isn't something that we understood because we saw the power of credit in those early days, and how could anything be greater? But let me share with you just one startling statistic, which I've only recently heard, but I think it answers the question about why do we do banks and why does the future need to have ways that we serve the poor with what they need, not what we think they need. It is that the statistics show that 98% of the people that we seek to serve, those chronically poor people living on less than $2 a day, 98% of them use informal savings. You don't know what that is because you have a bank that you can deposit your paychecks into. But informal savings means that people put money under the mattress, they put money in bamboo poles, the women wrap money in a scarf and wrap it around their waist or around their neck, and that's the way they save money because they don't have an alternative to have some little bit of money stored up. Because what you may not realize if you don't look at it is that when we say people live on $1 or $2 a day, that doesn't mean that today is Thursday and I get my dollar today. It may not mean that I get my dollar tomorrow or Saturday either. Yet I need some income, I need some cash, I need some way to be able to feed my family today and tomorrow and Saturday. So I need some savings because maybe I don't make any money until Sunday. So 98% of poor families globally use informal savings, but the statistic that grabbed our hearts at a conference just a few weeks ago that we held at Opportunity is that on average, these people that use informal savings of maybe $20 or $30 is the total amount of wealth that they would have in their family. On average, they lose 22% of their savings per year. I just want you to think about that. How many of you are ready to sign up for an investment that's a guaranteed average loss of 22% per year? Yeah, I've done some of that, but not intentionally. Yet this is what people with $20 or $30 of total wealth live on. So the implications for Opportunity were pretty clear that we needed to find ways that we could provide a safe place to save for people that are living on such little amounts, and that we would respect those clients for their dollar that they could put into savings at any one time. So building formal financial institutions became sort of a call that we needed philanthropy to stand by our side to do this. And in the Q&A time, I may have a chance to share a little bit more about what we're doing in microinsurance, but the power of helping the poor to weather life's storms is the mission that we have of trying to make sure that with health insurance, a family with a sick child can get the child to the doctor or the hospital. A family with a death in that family doesn't have to sell their business in order to appropriately celebrate the death of that individual and can use life insurance to honor the person but to keep their children in school. And a farmer who is not creditworthy, not because he's not a good farmer, but because of the risk of weather or crop damage, can be protected and made creditworthy by the type of crop or weather insurance that we're doing to help provide the assurance that that family, that farmer, can have good seed and good fertilizer in order to plant good crops. So let me just end with a few thoughts on where I see the puck going, and then I know Carol wants me to answer that question. But there's just a few quick things that I'd like to suggest to you that I think philanthropy in the days to come, and with the admonition of all those people that were wrong in the early days, I think I'm pretty safe in a number of these, and that is I think philanthropy will continue to drive innovation. That as I think about what we've seen in the last 40 years, Opportunity celebrating our 40th, not our 50th anniversary this year, that innovation has been the key role of philanthropy in making sure that we're focused on how do you improve what it is that you're trying to do. That in the absence of philanthropy, we would not have started banks. In the absence of philanthropy, we would not have had the courage to say we're going to provide life insurance in sub-Saharan Africa to people that are infected with HIV. And oh, by the way, that's not an exclusion on your life insurance policy. In the absence of philanthropy, we would not have been able to do the things that we've done in this last 40 years. And in the absence of philanthropy, we won't be able to figure out how do we make sure that we provide the schools through school loans, the farming loans that allow us to reach the rural poor, the deepest levels of poverty in the years to come, or to make sure that we can make crop insurance universally available out in the hinterlands where it is most needed. So philanthropy will continue to drive innovation. Secondly, I think, and some of this would parallel on what Dennis has described, but philanthropy will drive increasing accountability. That donors want to see results from their funding and they want to be involved in our work with their money. For opportunity, we're fortunate in that we have many ways that we can plug in donors through service on boards and tapping into their expertise, because so much of what we do is the business model applied to a social outcome. So we have a chance to take advantage of people that bring the skill sets to the table to serve the mission that we all have. Thirdly, philanthropy will drive a learning agenda, much as it is today. There's a huge appetite to learn what works and what doesn't. And unlike the corporate world that I lived in for a big chunk of my career, there's a willingness to collaborate in the nonprofit world to learn what works from one another. Just next week, I'll be in San Francisco at the Midiar Network Forum, where they bring all of their grantees together. Mari will be there, Dennis's wife, and we're looking forward to sharing and learning from one another. And finally, I believe philanthropy will get increasingly personal. That through opportunity today, we have the ability to connect a donor sitting in the U.S. with a loan client sitting any place in the world that might need funding for their loan. And the person sitting here at their computer can pick the person that they want to support, help provide the loan funds that will help advance that person's business, and then track progress over time. And although that's a microcosm of what we do between the developed world and the developing world, I think that sense of connectedness is something that we will see more of, because today in Malawi, some 90% of our clients have access to a cell phone. So the ability to connect the poorest of the poor with the wealthiest of the rich just means that I think that we'll see opportunities. So those would be the four trends that I see in terms of where the puck is going: that philanthropy will continue to drive innovation, that philanthropy will drive increasing accountability, philanthropy will drive a learning agenda, and philanthropy will be increasingly personal. And the short answer to Carol's question comes back to what's the role of philanthropy, what's the role of investment. And we can talk more about India, but if you get it wrong, if that you think you're in business to make a financial return, instead of you're in business to serve the poor, and financial returns are a mean to that end, it can lead to lots of bad things. And anybody that thinks that you can grow a business serving any customer set with growth rates of 100% per month and stay true to a philanthropic mission, I would argue is fooling themselves. And I don't lose hope for what we're doing opportunity, because I hope that and know that we're going to focus on serving the poor as the end that we seek, and the financial returns are the means to the end, not the end in themselves. So thank you much for this time together. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, David. That was great.
Thank you, David. That very, very wise remarks on microfinance, and I know there'll be lots of questions afterwards. Byron, Director of the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor, and supporting our religious giving survey, and we thank you for that, and we're anxious to hear about everything you're doing there.
Thanks, Carol. It's good to be here. Let me tell you just briefly about the institute that I direct. We're kind of a think tank on religion, and it's not bragging to say that we're the most muscular think tank in the world dedicated to the scientific study of religion. The reason why that's not bragging is there aren't too many of them out there. Most universities have a person or two that are interested in empirical studies of religion, but if you do that, you find yourself typically by your lonesome. When I moved to Baylor in 2004, we thought we should do some kind of in-depth study on religion that would kind of reshape the way people think about religion. We've known for about 7 decades that most Americans are religious. We know that most Americans pray. We know these basic things about Americans, but we don't go very deep in our surveys. So we got a project funded by the Templeton Foundation, and we worked with the Gallup organization, and we asked well over 300 questions on religion. It wasn't enough just to ask people, do you believe in God? We wanted to ask people how they pray, when they pray, why they pray, to whom they pray. We wanted to ask people what they thought about God. What were their impressions? How would you describe God? And the findings were pretty remarkable. We asked people about their experiences and their beliefs. 55% of the American public has had a personal experience with a guardian angel. That's kind of staggering. That's not Christians or some religious group. It's 55% of the American public in whole. One of the more interesting findings that we found was that people have different views of God in America, and you could almost divide America into 4 different sections, and that these views of God that people held almost could allow us to predict their views in politics and on moral issues. And it was pretty remarkable. When we had this press conference, the first thing a reporter said to us, well, just exactly what kind of a God does Oprah believe in? And it's like, well, that's not exactly what we were trying to figure out, but it's what the reporters wanted to know. Where would Tom Cruise be? But it did make some sense to us that your view of God would actually affect how you act and behave. The reason why I mention that is because when you turn to generosity, I think that we're in the same space. What we know is thin, very thin. That's why Carol and Hudson should be commended for undertaking this work. I think it's really important. And I like to use the term generosity rather than philanthropy because I think what we're really talking about is so much more than money. It's time, talent, and treasure. And how do you measure this? And to be candid, I don't think very many people have done this well at all. For the last 2 years, I've been hanging around a bunch of what we call generous givers in the Christian community. I find these people very fascinating. Some of these people reverse tithe. They give 90% of their income away and they live on 10%. And these are all people that are incredibly wealthy. Some give it all away. There are people that are worth $200 and $300 million that live on $80,000 a year. They live on a fixed income. These people are rather bizarre. I'd like to know what's going on in their lives. There's a study coming out of Boston College very soon, and the findings were leaked recently. You may have seen an article in Atlantic Monthly about the super rich. They interviewed a bunch of couples, and you couldn't get included in the study unless you're worth $25 million. And basically, what the article seemed to indicate is that these are the most miserable people you'll ever meet. They're not happy. They worry all the time. Their money is a burden. And you're thinking, okay, they are worth at least $25 million. One was quoted as saying, you know, we were doing pretty good till that other yacht went right by us and they just looked down on us. And so here you have a bunch of filthy rich people that are miserable. But I've been hanging around all these generous givers, and I haven't seen too many of them that are miserable, and they give it all away. There's so much work that we need to do to be able to understand what really goes into generous behavior. And that's why we think it's important to look at religion. One of my mentors is David Larson. Some of you may be familiar with him, the late David Larson, who lived in Rockville, but is obviously from the D.C. area. And David would always tell me that religion's the forgotten factor. People always forget to include it in their analyses. So when scholars stumble upon religion, it kind of scares them. Where did this variable come from? Because it's a very robust variable, and it helps explain all kinds of things. I just released a book this last week called More God, Less Crime. In there, I reviewed 273 studies on religion, and we found that 90% of them find an inverse effect. The more faithful people are, the less likely they are to have any problems in crime and delinquency and deviant behavior. For some of you, you're going to say, well, my grandmother could have told you that. But for my fellow academics, it's a stunning finding and a troubling one at that. You know, what are they supposed to do with that? I was at this conference of these generous givers in Atlanta 2 weeks ago, and I heard someone say that giving in congregations is down from 3% of net worth or net income to 2%. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Where did that come from? So I asked, and that came from a footnote that someone read in a paper. So I tracked this footnote down, and this is the same footnote that people have been citing for 20 years. Well, it came from, I did finally find it. It was from the Yearbook of American and Canadian Churches. They had simply taken a number of denominations and looked at their giving for the denomination, and then they had divided by the number of supposed members. And that's where they came up with the figure. The figure is totally bogus. And yet, here you have the leaders of this movement using it as if it's a proven fact. We don't know what it is, but we should. So that's what I'm hopeful that we can do in partnership with Hudson, that we can do these studies of philanthropy and generosity to actually see what we're doing. My sense is, Carol, it's much bigger. Every time we study the effects, we're always surprised. So I do think that you're right. I think you're capturing a good chunk, but I would be surprised if it wasn't much larger. And Carol said, and I want you to make some predictions. I said, we don't do predictions unless we have time series analysis for about 20 years, you know. But I'll go out on the limb since you're going to edit this out. Here's just something to think about. Is the world getting more religious? We know that religion is associated with all kinds of good behavior, pro-social behavior, including giving. Arthur Brooks has proven this quite well in his book, Who Really Cares? So assume for a second that we know religious commitment is associated with generosity. Is the world becoming more religious or less religious? There are a lot of people that think the world is becoming more secular by the day. Is it? I would argue that it isn't. If you look at the global south, it's almost the best kept secret that religion is flourishing in Africa, in Latin America, in China. We just completed a survey in China. We have an article published on the number of Christians in China. It is not what missionaries had hoped, but it's far greater than what some people had suspected. So, if you look at the world in 50 years, what is it going to look like? And I would argue it's going to look a lot more religious than it looks today, not more secular. That you will have missionaries from the global south that are going to start evangelizing the global north, and they already have started this process. Even in Europe, which some people are now calling the first post-secular society, we're seeing unusual things that indicate a rebirth of faith in Europe, which a lot of people have written off. So I would argue, if you look at the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then we would call the BRIC plus Kim, Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia. What are you seeing in these countries? These countries will be leaders economically in the world in 20 to 50 years. We're also seeing remarkable transitions in the faith communities in these countries. So if I had to make a guess, I would guess as faith flourishes in these places, so will giving and philanthropy, and that we'll be in a much better place. And I sure hope that we can do some good research that will help us clarify whether or not that's true. Thank you.
Thank you, Byron.
Thank you, Byron. And we're really looking forward to everything you're producing there. And I know you put together a fabulous scholarly team, and we're excited about that. So now we're going to end up our little panel here with Susan Raymond, who is the Executive Vice President for Changing Our World. And in addition to her extensive research writing and advisory services on philanthropy, a lesser-known fact about her is that she's actually an expert in global health and has done really groundbreaking work. She was writing about the threat of chronic diseases and non-communicable diseases in the developing world before the term NCDs ever came out. So she has many talents, and today she's going to take us to we're going to skate with her into the future. Thank you, Susan. Oh, and Susan got to have a few slides today, by the way.
Ha ha. First thing I'm going to do, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. Byron, I just want to give you a little tip here in terms of your religion studies. See, I'm a Catholic, and let me explain to you how we do it. We do 2, sometimes 3 collections. And I got curious about a year ago what happened to that. So they took up the first collection, and then they took up the second collection. The second collection was for a Passionist priest from Guatemala who had come to speak to us at church. took up another collection, then we took up another collection. But in between the second and third collection, I actually turned around. First time I ever had. Looked in the back of the church to see what happened to the second collection. Went in the same bag as the first collection. This is why we have an empirical problem with philanthropy and religion. My younger brother, Carol, was actually a semi-pro hockey player. So I spent a good bit of time on the ice when I was young with him. And the thing I want to say about the analogy of skating to where the puck will be is that I think that the problem with that is that the puck is actually levitating, turning orange, passing through the time warp of a black hole in the process of our trying to skate to it. I think what we have here in philanthropy, what we're seeing in philanthropy, is actually a very exciting time. I think we're in the middle of the end of definitions. What we used to mean by philanthropy, what we used to mean by nonprofits, the distinctions we used to make between these things and commercial operations and public operations and government money, all of these definitions are merging together. All of these definitions are blending into one another. So it's increasingly difficult to say what is philanthropy, what is commercial transaction, what is investment, what is giving. And I think that's happening because of the younger generation of philanthropists. It's a very exciting time. I actually moderated a panel of young philanthropists at the UN earlier this year. You want a depressing story? The young man next to me, first to speak, was 28 years old and selling his 4th company. My youngest son's best friend was one of the young philanthropists. My youngest son graduates from Notre Dame next week. These are young people who have an entirely different view of what the social commons is about, an entirely different view of what their role is, and they are going to levitate that puck, turn it orange, and pass it through the black hole. And why is that? Well, the first thing, as I said, is generational change. Andrew Carnegie, when he first began to talk about his philanthropy publicly and made his big philanthropic moves, was 54. The life expectancy of an American male at that point in time was 52. He was, for all intents and purposes, at the end of his life. Bill Gates started his philanthropy in a major way at age 39. Jeff Skoll started his foundation when he was 34. The average life expectancy of an American male today is 78. They're going to be around this game for a long time. And they're not interested in problems. They're not interested in moving their money to problems. They're interested in moving their money to solutions. And they're not even interested in moving their money to solutions because they don't think philanthropy is about the money. They think it is about leadership commitment on the societal commons. When I talk to these young philanthropists up at the UN, they actually don't see a difference between the way they're looking at their investment portfolios and the way they're looking at their, quote, philanthropy. It is all driven toward social commons and social advancement. They're an extraordinary group of people, and they will levitate the puck. The second reason it's changing is because of complexity. The problems that we face, the problems that are in front of us, the opportunities that are in front of us, the technology solutions in front of us are all extremely complex. And it's going to take time and engagement to be able to overcome that complexity. The third reason is a sense of scale. The average foundation grant in the United States is $25,000. You don't fix very much for very long at $25,000. They understand that it's going to have to be a long-term commitment of major resources and major skills and major leadership to make global change. And then the fourth reason they're going to levitate the puck is sustainability. I was on the phone with the chairwoman of Women Moving Millions yesterday, and she said, the youngest partner ever at J.P. Morgan, and she said, we will not sustain any solutions by giving money to them. We must think about our philanthropy as an investment in solutions. So what does that all look like? Carol, can I? Now I have a few slides, which nobody else got to do. Unfair after the fact. Did you think to ask? No. All right, so now I have to work it. All right. Oh, and this is not the one with my fly-ins. Okay, this is good. 30 years ago, this was the architecture of resources. We had some multilateral money, we had some bilateral money, and we had a touch of charity on the top. Okay, that was the architecture yesterday. It is amazing to me, it is completely astounding to me, that today, in international development, anybody wants to still live in that house. I don't see why we're stuck there, because that's the house tomorrow. It's program-related investing, mission-related investing, impact investing. Speaking of impact investing, J.P. Morgan issued a report in November of last year saying that impact investing has the potential to be a new asset class, like equity and bonds. If that's true, we have trillions of dollars moving to social problem solving. And the J.P. Morgan study was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. We have social investment, we have social enterprise, we have corporate philanthropy, and then we have CSR, CSE, and CRM, all of which are corporate social engagement mechanisms that are funded out of marketing budgets, not philanthropy. So we have marketing money moving to problem solving. Then we have product embedded transfers. We have e-philanthropy. We have mobile donations. We have global giving. We have bond and equity tools. Bonds, social bonds. Toby Eccles in London just concluded a $5 million, his first $5 million social bond placement in London for to reduce recidivism rates in the British justice system. It's a fascinating financing tool. The first bond money was raised from philanthropists and foundations. But if it works, there's no reason that this bonding mechanism can't expand in terms of its financial role. And after he closed that bond deal, okay, after he closed that bond deal, March 1, he opened up an office in Boston. And he has a major U.S. legal firm now putting together a social bond mechanism in the United States. It's going to completely change the way we look at funding. So what do we have here? What we have is an arc of innovation. We have traditional resource transfers, which are charitable grants. And what I want to say is charitable grants will be forever fundamental in philanthropy. Check writing will be fundamental.
And my question to you is, as you look for the component of religious giving in philanthropy, what role, if any, is ECFA? How are you going to find, as Carol pointed out in her diagram from the Hudson, it's not easily trackable. What methods of research and engagement are you going to employ through your organization at Baylor to track this kind of giving?
We want to do, I'm not, oh, I guess I should, is that, am I on?
Is he on? Or maybe just move a little closer, like real close. Do you have a green light?
Yeah, I do have a green light.
Okay, but I think you'll have to put it like
Even
this
closer?
close. Yep.
Okay, there you go. The whole giving piece is so complicated. We could be here all day trying to answer how you would measure. One of our partnerships is with the Gallup organization and the Gallup World Poll. The Gallup World Poll is now in 162 nations, where they take nationally representative samples of these populations in 162 nations, such that we now have a representative sample of the world's population. where we actually know what the world thinks on any one issue. We're trying to raise funds right now to be able to ask people about their own giving. That's our first priority. That's what we would really like to be able to do, and not just one question, but a series of questions, perhaps even giving people scenarios under which they might consider giving. That would be the first thing that we would like to do while we continue to work with Carol and perfect what we're already doing through this publication. But there are so many other projects that we want to get to. One of the first things we want to get to is gender. Recently, we've been told that unless you start looking at women and philanthropy, you're missing the boat. And I think that that's probably correct. But this is wide open. We know really very little in these cases. So what we're trying to do is just kind of prioritize, almost triage, where would you begin first if you were going to do these kinds of studies? And for us, being able to do these individual level studies are really important. And then from there, it's just the sky's the limit. But of course, we would need to raise some funds to go out and do this good work. We're hoping that that will happen for us. But you raise a huge can of worms with that question.
Good question. Okay, who's next on the questions?
Hi, my name's Stephanie Cade, and I work for the Batanga Foundation. And I'm just going to address this to the panel. There's a growing presence of middle-income donors, such as China, especially in Africa. So I'm just wondering, considering the diversity of religions and cultures, and also the difficulty in tracking the exact motives for giving aid and the amounts, how you think that might change where the puck is going in global philanthropy, and if you have any ideas of how to measure the motives and amount of middle-income donors.
I'm just going to quickly say that we have done some measurements in last year's index, Yulia, on the BRIC countries in the 2010. And the OECD is beginning to put a dollar amount around some of those countries. So talk to us afterwards and we'll give you that. But then I want to turn the question of motive and where is that philanthropy going, particularly in countries like China and countries in other authoritarian communist countries. Where's that going to go? I mean, I guess you could ask the question, do we really want Warren Buffett and Bill Gates to be having the billionaires increase philanthropy if it's going to go the way of a Chinese business, which is all intertwined with the government, and what does that mean for those agendas? So whoever of you would like to chat.
Yeah, Carol, I think, it raises an interesting question that we really haven't talked about here. There are now 3 studies out there that are projecting the 2 billion new members of the global middle class by 2025. That's 2 billion with a B new middle class members. So we talk about philanthropy as though it's just about Bill Gates. And actually it's not just about Bill Gates. It may be surprising to him, but it actually isn't just about Bill Gates. And the real unknown here, the real booster rocket on the future number is really what happens when those 2 billion people start having disposable income in civil societies. And the systems in the data collection systems are so far behind the arc of that change that I think the methodological problem now for these kinds of studies is not speed, it's trajectory. It really is, what is the trajectory of work that's going to intercept that pre-existing change? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think that is really the booster rocket.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments on that?
Yeah, I might just add a perspective that it's pretty easy for those of us that have been involved from the West to say that we generate the dollars and send them to the places in the world where they're needed. And I think that's also part of old philanthropy instead of where the puck is going. And I say that having come back from Singapore pretty recently, where a developing nation, if you will, has now stepped forward as going to be one of the entities that is helping to raise funds from Singapore. But even more importantly, the CEO of U.S., Bill Morgenstern, just got back from Colombia, where we're launching a new bank down there to serve the poor in Colombia. But one of the most interesting things is that he's also looking at how do we raise funds from Colombians in order to serve their country. And that's a model that we need to do a whole lot more of. And I'd actually argue as we think about a civil society and how do you help transform societies, then this theme of generosity, whether we call it generosity instead of philanthropy, is a critical dimension that allows us to see whether we're really having impact, we collectively, whether the country is changing, is whether or not people care about one another. And so this whole theme and being able to link people in country to solutions in country is where I think we'll end up, whether it's a decade from now or 20 years from now, I don't know, but I think that's the trend.
One of the interesting words that you mentioned was motive. And I think we have to acknowledge that there's always been a huge range of motives. Motives in foreign aid, motives in philanthropy. Carnegie was not exactly the nicest fellow in the world, and he was feeling a little cranky as he got older, and he really kind of felt guilty and felt that he ought to do something about it. China has obviously some interests at stake. There's going to be a wide range of motives in religious giving as well as non-religious giving. The bottom line is, what is the impact and what happens with the money with the money that's given. And I think the exciting thing about where the orange puck is levitating through the black hole to, is this ability to observe what happens with the money that's given, really for the first time, not through periodic studies, much more in real time. And when you have this, the conversation becomes about that and less about motives. I don't care what Carnegie's motives were, as long as I realized that he educated a whole bunch of medical students or provided reading skills for people like that. I couldn't care less whether he was doing it for whatever reason.
Yeah, the other thing that I would just point out, just to build on what you were saying, that the Colombia example, we were working with the Global Fund for HIV/AIDS the last 2 years and helped them develop something called Gift from Africa, which is a pooled fund that's being funded by Africans to fund the HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria programs in Africa.
Okay, next question.
I intertwine with the Total Family Care Coalition. I think that it's been long overdue for this change, but my concern is with regard to regulatory issues and let's just say business classifications. With so many countries, especially Western countries, that are feeling the impact of the economy and also decreased population within their own populace, how do you see this changing the way that we're classified, number one? And what do you see as potential regulatory blockage and licensing?
I mean, that's for my money. I mean, that's one of the biggest problems, is that we don't actually understand that arc very well. You know, Toby Eccles understands social bonds. I only understand him insofar as a poor, weak-minded economist can understand finance, which isn't very well. And there are all these variations that don't, because they're blurring the lines, we don't understand them very well. We don't know what to do with them. We don't know how to treat them. And what we tend to do when we see things that we don't know what to do with, we tend to cram them in to holes that we already have, or we tend to quash them because they don't fit. So one of the things that I'm concerned about is I speak at a lot of philanthropy conferences and stuff around the world, and the agendas of those conferences. I actually took the agenda from one of the conferences 2 years ago, and I went back and I got an agenda from 20 years ago, and it was the same agenda. Same issues, same topics, same panels, same rubrics, same categories. We are not, as a sector, the philanthropic and nonprofit sector is not making a concerted effort to intercept this arc of change and understand it so that we can actually strengthen it as opposed to suppress it because we don't understand it. And I think it's a huge Achilles heel on the sector and on that evolution.
Any other comments?
And maybe that's something, Carol, when you think about the index next year, you know, is to maybe try to think about, maybe there's a way for that the index could unpack some of this, and if not, and at least think about what would be the common characteristics or the typology here that would help ignite people to start thinking about this in a more disciplined way?
I'm pessimistic on that, and because I've been to the same conference. And my take on that is, unless philanthropy field feels some heat, it's not going to change. And it's not the field as a whole; it's individuals in the field. But for those of you associated with any foundation board or anything like that, it's the nicest thing in the world. There's no pressure on you to do anything. It's the best possible, coziest position you could ever have.
Absolutely.
You come together once a month or once a quarter, and you have all these program officers who are hired to serve you, serve things up to you to make you feel good about what you've done. And that is their absolute job, and they do it really well at good foundations. And then you talk to your friends, you have lunch, and you go home, and you feel good about yourself. There are very few foundations in the world where the board meeting opens up with a screen that shows what the beneficiaries think about what they've done. Where no matter how their program officers paper over what's happened, it's all irrelevant because people in the field say, I like this or I don't like this. There's no foundation that I know of that has that direct feedback that makes some of the new instruments that Susan's talking about so appealing. When those feedback loops start to happen, when that board meeting opens with the screen of what the market, what their clients think of what they're doing, then you will see change. You're not going to see change at the EXO Foundations meeting.
Making the distinction between the beneficiaries and the grant recipients.
Exactly. Sure. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, no,
The grant recipients are usually happy.
Absolutely right. Yes. No, absolutely right. Very good distinction. Yeah.
Good one. Good one. Yes. Okay. More questions. Anyone? Am I missing somebody? Okay, right here in the front. Good.
This 50-year-old guy right here.
Yeah, our 50-year-old here.
Hi, yeah, 50-year-old. I'm here today. My name's Bruce Smith, and I'm representing the Board of Governors for Opportunity International. My question is on the financial situations of the U.S. government and the European governments, as far as we're seeing incredible deficits projected out for another 40, 50 years. How will that affect global giving, and will individual taxes, if they have to go up, how will that affect global giving?
Well, I mean, today's, I don't know if it was in the Washington Post, but the New York Times, had an article today on the front page that there is a huge movement. There has been for the past 5 or 6 years, but a huge movement on the part of states and city government to start to twist the arms of nonprofits to contribute to the tax base of the state and the community. It's interesting. One of my colleagues at the company was elected mayor of a town in New Jersey. I won't tell you which town, but mayor of the town in New Jersey. And I asked him whether it was true that the nonprofit sort of weight on a community tax base was significant. And he said the first thing he did when he got elected mayor was ask for the tax rolls. And what he found out was that 50% of the property in his town was off the tax rolls because it was owned by nonprofits. And so there's going to be a very serious look at this. States attorneys general are looking at this right now in terms of what constitutes nonprofit status. One of the things we're doing, we started a fellowship program at the company, and we have a fellow starting on June 6th, our second one. First one was in social enterprise. This is in public finance. And we're going to go state by state. And we're going to look at the implications of budgetary cutbacks and crisis and the longevity of that on nonprofit relevant sectors, education, healthcare, social services, and start to project out what the weight, how heavy is the lift going to be for philanthropy. And the question of whether we really have to get very serious about social finance domestically and very serious about innovation and creativity in social finance domestically to be able to pick up some of that weight. And whether things like, Opportunity International are actually going to have the opportunity to have a much more robust domestic presence in a lot of ways because of some of it.
Yeah, as Bruce well knows, I mean, I think the answer is that that arc that you saw has to be part of what we're doing. I mean, I've already described the history to say deposits and borrowing funds locally were the first two steps. You know, we would love to figure out how do we have a $100 million capital fund right now that we could deploy globally across the places in the world that most need capital. And how do we do that, and what's the right timing for do that? We're talking about that now. I don't know when, or I don't know how, but the kinds of things that you heard described from what's going on in England with the social fund there, that's the kind of thing that I think we're going to have to do, because we can't be reliant on government as the source of funding that it was in the past, and frankly, it isn't even today. I mean, that's a rear view mirror that's very different than what I think the forward-looking direction is.
Mm-hmm. Great. Any other questions? If not, I'll do just a quick summary. I said I would do sort of a summary synthesis, and I'm really sorry I said I would do that. But I'm going to try to do it, and
we're going to enjoy it.
Yeah. I know you are. I know you are. Of where this puck is going. It's one. There'll be new definitions for sure, and that came out with Byron in terms of generosity versus philanthropy, and time, talent, and treasure. And I think, Susan, that corresponds with you talking about that time, talent, and treasure is that leadership commitment, really, that you all were converging there. Two, Susan, you talk about the end of definitions. So I think there will be new definitions, and there'll be an end of some definitions of whether, a nonprofit or whether helping people is only done through a 501c3 or a 501c4 or a new kind of mechanism, which is, I wish we would have had time to spend the whole much longer time on what's a PRI and what all these acronyms are. I don't even know half of them. I've heard of them, but I couldn't define them if my life depended on them. So I think this moving capital in larger amounts through all kinds of financial tools is huge, and we're going to need new definitions for that. And I loved your comment about being loyal to solutions and not institutions, and I think that helps me understand that as well. I think both Byron and Susan really talked about philanthropy increasing, and we may be. This is the prediction I may be reading in 5 years from now. How wrong you were, but I do, Byron. If you're right about religiosity increasing, and I tend to share your view on that from a variety of studies and feelings. And we do know that philanthropy is associated with religiosity, that I think that will help. I also think all the things, Susan, you're talking about in terms of the younger billionaires now is having more time to spend this fortune, and the 2 billion middle class it's going to increase what my favorite phrase is that Dennis Whittle has said. I don't think you said it today, but there are ordinary Oprahs out there, and that is going to grow in amount, and it's going to be far bigger than what the billionaires are doing. And so that's a huge thing that we're just now beginning to think about. I think transparency, this is what Dennis just, with your first story, brings out so beautifully with, if you can just shine the light on it, get the sunshine on the project, any government project, by new ways of evaluating, whether it's public opinion polls, whether it's posting what the project should be. I remember when we were doing some of our aid projects for Eastern Europe when the wall fell, Susan, I think you and Jerry came up with the idea, well, let's don't have an evaluation of the hospitals that we're helping. Why don't we see if we can get them certified by the Joint Accreditation of Certification? So let's look at different ways of evaluating that can be helpful to these projects. And we've been remarkably low in creativity about how to. And Dennis changed the whole project under Global Giving just by doing a public opinion poll. And we could be using these techniques and not have to worry about these expensive baseline surveys and double-blind surveys, which are going to kill us and have kept people from, or given people good excuses, not to evaluate. So transparency, big real-time feedback loops, I think will drive the learning agenda that you talk about, David, and that will connect the poorest of the poor with the richest of the rich. So I think you're absolutely right, and I think that fits in that transparency bucket. Democratization of voice, people involved in the solutions. When I first joined AID, we didn't even talk about grant recipients or beneficiaries. Do you know what we called the people we were helping? Target groups. And I remember my first AID meeting, and I said, "What's a target group?" "Oh, you mean the people we're helping?"
You thought you were a DOD, right?
I did. Did I walk in the wrong room? So we've got to get to that word beneficiary, or maybe something that's even warmer and nicer than that. You know, got any ideas? Anything better than beneficiary? Yeah, I mean, so we'll be working on that, and maybe all of you can help as well. The philanthropy driving innovation, I just think that is so true, and we had to have the technology there to do it, but philanthropy really is trying new things with this technology. And the cell phones in Africa, because they just couldn't pay any more bribes to the people they'd have to meet on the corner to get their phone call through the landlines and all of this. And so, and the philanthropists see it and are able to do it more so than government agencies, because they can work with these new tools. So I love that point. So that's another bucket. And then I think just a final bucket, and then I want to ask you for a couple buckets too. New roles for donors. I think, Susan, you know, you've made it clear in philanthropy, and the rest of you have too, about the new, not caring about the structure. And, you know, philanthropists are going to have to, you know, loosen up and look at these other mechanisms. And I love, Dennis, what you said about new roles, especially for governments. And this has been my hobby horse as well, that governments have to, they're the minority shareholder now of all these resources. They still need to be involved, but less in a donor-recipient mode than as a, I think you were saying this, Dennis, a convener or facilitator of resources, linking groups together and looking, what are the most successful private things going out there where they can take their limited money and leverage some of those, leverage that private philanthropy, acting more like a foundation than their traditional government role, with still obviously needing government roles in post-conflict resolution, refugees, and all of that. But on the development side, there's a completely new role. So new definitions, philanthropy's increasing, and I will say it because Susan wouldn't say it. She really thinks that there's a paradigm shift in philanthropy, but she said, I won't say that word because it's so hackneyed and overused. But I think the evidence is out there for this to be huge. And I think I will say it, paradigm shift here, and then I can be called wrong at some stage. But increasing transparency, democratization of voice, philanthropy driving innovation, and entirely new roles for donors are areas that I see. So could I have some other synthesis from some of our panelists? Big picture? Oh, good. Thank you. Okay.
I'm fond of giving people assignments, so I'll actually give you an assignment. It's the old student in me that I like to do this. And it's actually where Carol and Dennis ended in terms of thinking about philanthropy. It's too easy to be comfortable. So what I'd actually like to challenge everybody in the room with is how not to be comfortable, whether it's in your own philanthropy or whether you're in a corporate role of some sort giving away money. The question is, how do you get better? And how do you make sure that you're really excellent at what you're doing? And I'm no longer at Bridgeband, so I can give a plug that's not tied to this, but I've had the joy of working with a guy by the name of Tom Tierney for the last 8 years, who just this last month published a book called Give Smart, Philanthropy That Gets Results. And it's funded by the Gates Foundation and Goldman Sachs, so there's some decent people behind it, but the whole book is structured around 6 questions that we as philanthropists ought to ask ourselves to figure out how do we give smart. And it's a broad definition of giving across the range of time, talent, and treasure. But I would actually give that as an assignment for anybody that's serious about getting better in your philanthropy. Go pick up a copy of that book and see what it will do in terms of causing you to think about how do you get better with your own philanthropy.
Carol, I would just, one last comment, I think. Actually have written an article about the paradigm shift.
Oh, okay.
But I didn't want to use that term here just because people don't actually understand what a paradigm is, and they use the term too lightly, and I think we actually are in a paradigm shift. But the one thing that I would caution is that all of this is very enthusiastic. You know, we're all very enthusiastic about all this change and all this innovation. But there are implications. and there are potential problems, and there are potential conflicts between what a private dollar wants to do itself and what a community wants to do, between, you know, really smart 28-year-olds and maybe what is really not a good idea. There isn't a market that will clear these ideas. There really are problems here about how you evolve that traditional three-part lean-to, you know, into that new architecture in a way that doesn't create more problems than it solves. And so I'm a big enthusiast for the paradigm shift. But I also believe that there are real questions here that need to be asked about how it is done in a very positive, productive, value proposition, value-added way. And I think that those are very important conversations to have as you move the whole global index forward. Very important to have these conversations because we actually don't understand very well where this puck is going.
Thank you, Susan. On that note of caution, I think you will all agree with me that we had the foxes today on our panel who look at the small details, never get too full of themselves, and are constantly evaluating what they're doing, and that's what I think made this panel so wonderful. So please, and thank you all for coming, and please join me in giving our panelists a big, big hand.